want to do kind of a final sound check, however, make sure everyone can hear my voice. We have Caitlin, who is helping kind of manage the technology side of things. So if you have any issues as we're moving along, please feel free to type in the chat box and she can help you out. If you're having issues with your sound or you're not seeing my screen, then please feel free to type in there and she can help you out. Well, we are going to get started. We are going to be recording this webinar so that folks can watch it later. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So welcome, everyone. I'm pleased to have you all with us today. Today we're going to be talking about the impact of parents' military service on children and the implication for education professionals. This webinar is presented to you from the American School Health Association, and the mission of ASHA is to transform all schools into places where every student learns and thrives. The American School Health Association envisions healthy students who learn and achieve in safe and healthy environments, nurtured by caring adults functioning within a coordinated school and community support systems. I just want to take a minute to suggest that you all save the date. We're going to be having our 92nd annual conference in Indianapolis on October 4th through 6th. So we hope that you will join us, and it should be a wonderful time for networking and professional development. So we hope you'll join us in Indianapolis. Just a couple of words about the benefits of being a member of ASHA. We have our Journal of School Health, which is our peer-reviewed indexed professional journal. We have that available in print and online. As I mentioned, our conference, members can receive a discounted registration rate to the conference. We have general sessions, oral sessions, posters, exhibits, and plenty of time for networking. And we also offer continuing education. We also have our School Health Action, which is our biweekly newsletter. And we offer continuing education free to members for things like this webinar today. We also have a career center where we offer discount rates for job postings. And we have 4 networking communities or communities of practice to kind of help facilitate discussions and online support for those of you engaged in school health. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our presenter. Kathy Broniarczyk is the Senior Director for Outreach and Operations at the Military Family Research Institute at Purdue University. Her work with the Family Support Team involves providing support and resources to children and families of service members, community organizations that assist military families, and community professionals who offer care for service members and their families. Ms. Broniarczyk is responsible for MFRI's outreach initiatives, including the STAR Behavioral Health Provider Program and Measuring Communities. Kathy received her bachelor's degree in Child and Family Sciences from the University of Wisconsin and her master's degree in Early Childhood Education from Boston University. She's worked with children and families her entire professional career. Kathy has been a public school teacher, an early childhood trainer for child care providers, child care center administrator, and preschool teacher. She's also worked with pre-service early childhood teachers and taught undergraduate early childhood courses. Prior to joining the MFRI team, Kathy served as the center director for the Department of Army Child and Youth Services in an overseas facility with a large population of deployed service members. She's worked with many military families for over 20 years and is also a military spouse. So I'm really pleased to introduce Kathy to you all, and I will give you control, Kathy, and let you, oh boy, let you drive the PowerPoint. Oops, excuse me. So take it away. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So what we did want to do today is to kind of talk about the impact of parents' military service on children and youth and what you can do as educational professionals. Oh, there we go. Oops, trying to catch control of the mouse. So really three objectives for today. I want to kind of work with you to kind of identify military affiliation in the youth within your communities and the differences within this population depending upon what type of affiliation. This may have implications for children and youth. I also want to review some research findings that kind of tell us about some challenges and benefits associated with being a military youth. In the last 10 years, there has been a lot of research based on looking at the impacts of this service on not only service members, veterans, and their families, but on youth in particular. And then also identify some strategies that you can employ within your profession that can support military youth in different school environments. As Jeannie said, I work at the Military Family Research Institute at Purdue University, and MFRI, we conduct research on issues that affect military and veteran families, and we work to shape policies, programs, and practices that improve their well-being. So very similar to your mission statement in terms of healthy environments, that's what we also want for our military service members, veterans, and their families. We were founded in 2000, and we kind of envision a diverse supportive community that understands these pressing needs of military and veteran families, which include youth. We do collaborate to try and create meaningful solutions for them. So not just here's the research, but how can you take that research and put that into practice? We are nationally recognized, and we're located within the Department of Human Development and Family Studies in the College of Health and Human Sciences here at Purdue University. So that's just a little bit about the Military Family Research Institute. And Jeannie pretty much covered most of my background. I've had 25 or more years of working with military families, and I do direct the family support team here at MFRI. A military spouse, I've lived both the active duty and the National Guard side. I am a parent of military youth. My children were born within the context of military communities, and our family has experienced deployments from September 11th, 2001 to May of 2008. In that 7 years, our family spent all of 18 months of that 7 years under one roof on any consistent basis. So knowing about separations, knowing about deployment, and have lived through the experiences of parent with military youth. So one of the things we want to take a look at and help define is who are military youth. When you look at children within your facilities, what makes them and how do we define military youth? So the first, there is a legal definition of a military, in air quotes, dependent. So the definition that's on the screen, the unmarried child under 21 or 23 if in college, of a current service member child, if they're older, that's incapable of self-support. This is really the legal definition and is necessary at the Department of Defense level because this determines benefits eligibility as well as access to services. So there has to be this legal definition of military dependent, and children are classified as dependents. But when you look at and you think about this definition, you think about children who might be impacted by a parent's military service or even a loved one's military service, this definition can be kind of limiting. And it's limiting for a few reasons. First, it does not include children of veterans. So these are people who are no longer serving but may have children in the home. And just because a parent is not currently serving does not necessarily mean that there's not an impact on the family unit, on the child, based on a parent's military service. So if you think about maybe even a young Marine who joined at 18, spent 2 to 3, 4 years in the Marines, deployed 2 or 3 times, saw extensive combat, but was not married at the time, has some lingering impacts from their military service, gets married, has children, the children are growing up in the family. That military service of that Marine when he was very young or she was very young may have lingering impacts on the children within that family. This definition also does not include children who have aged out as service members. So the children who are 25, 26, they may have also been impacted on their military service from their parents. Also looking at extended family members who might be impacted. Just because a lot of this just talks about your parents, that doesn't mean that you don't have children within your programs and in your schools that are not siblings of service members who are currently deployed or have deployed. Think, for example, you have a 16-year-old boy who has an 18-year-old brother who's a Marine, and they share a bedroom, and they're paintball buddies and they're Xbox buddies, and all of a sudden that brother goes off to deployment, starts military service. For that sibling, although they're never ever counted in a military youth number, they may still be impacted by that sibling going off to join the service, going off to deployment. And even I have this here on the slide, the grandchildren. Sometimes I like to joke about the slur that's uttered on the playground, your grandmother wears combat boots. Well, now within this generation that we've been deployed in the Middle East, yes, your grandmother can wear combat boots. And there have been stories where, grandparents, grandmothers have been deployed. And so that child within that school setting, even though it's not a parent, someone who may be very significant to that child is deployed, is away at military service. And so they can experience impacts too. So when we think about military youth, it's not just children whose parents are serving. There's this whole list of folks and children that don't neatly fit in this definition. So now that we're looking at, a broader definition, where might these children be located? Where are these kids? And so one of the things I want to show you is this is a map that really looks at the military-connected youth number of children by county across the U.S. Now these numbers represent active duty children, children of selected reserve, which are Guard and National Reserve, as well as children of veterans, so veteran households that have children. This unfortunately does not include some of those extended family members and children who have aged out, because they're simply not counted in any way, shape, or form that we have been able to locate. So this is just strictly children of veterans, those who are currently serving active duty, and those who are currently serving in the reserves or in the National Guard. So you can definitely see where pockets of high concentrations of military-connected youth might be. So depending upon where you are, you can see where and about how many might be in your particular county. Now the map does show the numbers of children. We said that they're active duty, selected Guard or Reserve, or veterans. And we do want to point out that there may be some important differences between active duty and selected reserve. So active duty, these are the 24/7, 365. These are those who wear the uniform every single day. They are typically located near military installations. This is their job, their only job. Versus part-time, which is the selected reserve. And the selected reserve is actually an umbrella term that incorporates the reserve component and the National Guard. So when you hear the term selected reserve, that's an umbrella term for both reserve and National Guard. And the selected reserves are the part-time, so the traditional 1 week in a month, 2 weeks during the year. But we also know from being in conflict for the last 17 years that a lot of our deployments have been for these reserve units, for these selected reserve units, and so the part-time ends up becoming full-time. Other important differences could be branch of service. Each branch of service has uniquenesses in terms of their jobs, um, what their military job is. So things like the Marines, they're the first in, first out. Army goes and secures land. Navy's at sea. Air Force has other duties. So the types and the lengths of deployment may vary within the branch of service. Typically, Air Force goes for shorter periods of time, but more often. When you have Navy families, they may go out to sea for 6 months and come back. And so a lot of it really depends upon branch of service. It also depends upon what units within that branch of service. So obviously things like special forces in the Army, the experience of children whose parents are in those might be very, very different, for example, than a regular Army unit. One of the differences is also geographical dispersion, and you can see from the map previously that there's a large difference between the number of children in different communities and different counties. So the geographical dispersion is really about those children that are not located around military installations. So these would be active duty folks who could be recruiters, and so they're in small towns and things like that. Those active duty folks who are at universities in the ROTC program. For selected reserve, these are the children that live in our communities across the country. So even though their parent may be serving in this unit, they may live in a community far from where the parent serves. Mobility is another difference. Military connected youth, especially active duty, have on average moved 3 times more than their civilian counterparts. So when you think about moving from school to school to school, some children by the time that they graduate from high school may have been in 6 or 7 different school settings, different communities, different school districts. And so this mobility can be a big difference for the children. Not as much with selected reserve or National Guard because they have a tendency to stay more within their community, but the mobility of the active duty youth. Isolation is another difference when we take a look at children who live around military installations do have peers who have had experienced very similar things to things that they've experienced. If I go to a school within a military community, either on the installation or nearby, many children within my class would have experienced a parent deploying. They know what it is to be military, what their parents do, and so I have camaraderie. It kind of normalizes the experience. If you look at the selected reserve children who may be one of a few that are in a school or in a school district, there's no peers that can say, yes, I know exactly what you mean. I know exactly how it feels when mom is deployed, when dad is deployed. When you have children in a school, so for example, when my daughters were going to school and their dad was deployed to Bosnia, their friends would come, oh yes, I understand how you mean, my dad's been gone on a business trip for a week and I miss him. Well, when you're saying that to a child whose parent has been gone for 6 months, it doesn't quite give the same feeling of, I understand or I know what you're going through because your parents only been gone a week and mine's been gone 6 months. So there's a sense of isolation in terms of nobody really understands what I am going through. You also have this suddenly military, and this can be a misnomer like, well, we already know that they're in the selected reserve. We already know they're in the military, so why is this sudden military? The sudden military really refers to all of a sudden being deployed. So especially with the National Guard, you have, as we've witnessed, 3 very devastating hurricanes that have happened in the United States over the course of the fall. And so National Guard troops may be called up and sent away to deploy on a moment's notice. There's not a lot of preparation for events like this. You don't get 6 months to prepare for a parent leaving. They get the notice and they're gone. And so those are some of the differences within that. And there's also community differences. Again, military installations There's a lot of, we've been through this before, we know how to do this, we've got our support systems in place, versus families who live in communities far away from military installations who may not be as familiar with how military service might impact the family. Oh, there we go. Excuse me. Military youth may also have some very uncommon experiences, and I post this picture here, and I'm going to read the caption for the picture. Amelia McNabb sleeps on a seat inside a C-17 Globemaster III at Baltimore Washington International Airport in April of 2016. Amelia is the daughter of two military parents. Defense Department of Dependents in Turkey were given a departure order by the State Department and Secretary of Defense. So what this means is that the family lived in Turkey based on her parents' military service. That is where they were stationed. And due to the events on the ground, the Department of Defense and the State Department determines that it's no longer safe for families to be there. So they're evacuated. So think about a child may come into your school. They have had this experience. They've been evacuated. They've told they have, 48 hours and they have to leave. And as this little child, you can see there's not a whole lot of stuff that they're bringing with them. They have to evacuate. So these are some common experiences, or I should say uncommon experiences, that our civilian children may never ever experience. Children around military installations, especially overseas, may have experiences such as you go onto the military installation, being stopped at the gate to inspect the vehicle for bomb sniffing dogs, those kinds of things. Military youth carry IEDs wherever they go. They have also potentially embraced the military ethos in terms of we take care of ourselves. We just kind of buck up, we move forward. So military youth may also have some uncommon experiences that our civilian children don't necessarily encounter. Another challenge with military youth is this military-civilian divide, and usually they talk about this in terms of adults, but I have the example here of the teacher in California just recently that involved a military youth. So the military-civilian divide usually talks about the extent to which civilians are less connected with the military, or their personal connections with someone in the military. They're not as intimately connected as they have in the past. And so we had a student who was in this teacher's class, and you can, read, or maybe you've heard about, some of the things that this staff member uttered. And there was a military connected youth within that classroom. And so that disconnect between what it really might mean to serve and the viewpoints of that person in authority or that teacher is that real disconnect. And how might that military connected youth feel about either their parent, their family member, when someone in authority is talking in this way? And so this can contribute to the isolation, the feelings of nobody understands what I'm going through, they just don't understand, or in this case, probably some stronger emotions as well. So when we're talking about military youth, we want to kind of look at some common stressors that they may be experiencing that their civilian counterparts may not. So we talked about the suddenly military, but usually families do get prior notice to when separations are going to happen, whether it's a combat deployment, deployment to another area, extended schools, those kinds of things, any kind of separation. Usually there is time to prepare. And so the child and the family go through this preparation for the extended separation from a primary caregiver. Also, depending upon the age of the child, there are going to be altered family roles and responsibilities. So from what I understand from Jeannie, most of you work in the middle school and high school arenas versus the much younger children. So typically older children take on more caregiving and family role responsibilities as compared to their younger siblings. So this may be things in terms of maintaining the household, doing some chores that the separate or the parent who is gone used to take care of, whether it's something simple as taking out the trash or mowing the lawn, or taking care of younger siblings. Now, some of this does not necessarily mean it's bad. There's nothing wrong in most families with 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds taking responsibility for the trash or making sure that certain things are taken care of. It depends upon the maturity level of that child, what the altered family role, the responsibilities actually are. But these could be stressors, especially if they're trying to balance schoolwork, their personal life, and then these altered family roles. Sometimes they do have to cope with this increased stress on the non-military parent or caretaker, this caretaker becoming now the sole parent, or in some cases, if it's a single parent and that parent is now gone, who does that child live with? And so if you look at what might be a typical family situation, a single parent is going away, on deployment, and then that child either goes with an aunt, with an uncle, family member, grandma, grandpa, that may not necessarily be used to taking care of a child, and now that stress on that non-military caretaker may be something that that child has to cope with. There's also concerns about the safety of the deployed parent. So depending upon the deployment, where they're going, what they're doing, or maybe they don't know what they're doing, that can cause stress in terms of the safety. Is my parent going to be okay? So when we have families, for example, in the National Guard that get deployed to help recover from a tornado, there's not always a lot of concern about safety of the deployed parent. They're helping people who, there's no imminent threat of additional tornadoes, or, the hurricane is gone and now we're just helping clean up. That's very, very different than they're going overseas. They're going to Iraq, they're going to Afghanistan, they're going to Africa. We've got military folks deployed across the globe. And so I may worry about the parent and their safety because I may not be sure what's happening where they are. There also can be conflicting emotions about this service. So I could be really happy and very proud that my parent is serving the military, they're helping their country, they're fighting for freedom, all of those kind of patriotic kinds of things. There also may be emotions on the other side that they're missing my birthday again, they're always gone when I need them, they're missing so much of my life. And so there's these conflicting emotions, and they could feel pride on one day, but also then potentially anger on another day. And so they have these conflicting emotions about the service. They also can have conflicting emotions about their parent being gone. And this is something as school professionals you also want to kind of think about as you interact with these children. A lot of times we assume that children are upset, they're sad that their parent is gone, their parent is deployed, which in most cases that is. But if you think about, not all families are functioning at optimum levels, and there may be some families where the tension between a parent and a child can be significant, and they butt heads and they argue. And if that parent deploys, then maybe that child feels good because all of that stressor in terms of the conflict with the parent has now been put on the back burner, and they don't have to worry about that because the parent is gone. And so assuming that the child is really very sad about the parent being gone, when in actuality that child may actually be happy that the parent is gone because there's less stress, can produce some conflicting emotions about how they should be feeling as opposed to what they actually are feeling. And then, of course, coping with any changes when that parent actually does return from deployment or from wherever they were. Are they actually the same? What if they are injured? Those kinds of things. So with those stressors, with those differences, things that children encounter, we probably want to ask ourselves the question about, so how are they doing? If we're hearing all this bad stuff, how are they actually doing? Well, when we take a look at it, overall, military families and military children are doing well. They are resilient. At this point in time, they've been through this probably more than once. They've had their times where they've had to solve problems. They've been resilient. They've been getting through the situations. And so overall, they are resilient. We do have a recent RAND study that tracked over 3,000 military families over 3 years to get a really good idea about what they are experiencing. And some things from the study: outcomes ranging from parent stress to spouse depression to teenage anxiety. Study highlighted what we call remarkable resilience in military families. So even though families may have challenges, there may be times where it seems like we're having tremendous difficulties, overall there is remarkable resiliency within military families. They get through it and on the other side doing pretty well. It's not exactly how they started, but they come through on the other side still functioning quite well. And also looking at family function, there may be some changes within that family function during the deployment, but on the back end, the post-deployment, there is a steady return to some pre-deployment baselines. So when we look at family reintegration, family relationships, and their well-being, generally they return to the levels that they were before. So in terms of significant changes, this RAND study did not find any truly significant differences. But we also want to look at what families are telling us. So this is what the RAND study has found, but we also want to take a look at what families are telling us. And so every 2 years, the Department of Defense does a survey of spouses in military families. And the last one they did was in 2016. And this is what one of the questions was, the children's emotional and behavioral changes in response to deployment. So within the last 24 months, what are at least some of the challenges? And so you look at this chart, and when you take a look at fear and anxiety and problem behaviors at home, about a third of the children have had increased issues in terms of fear and anxiety and problem behaviors at home. So we could look at it in one way in terms of, gosh, 2/3 really have no issues. 66% of our children are doing really, really well. There's been no change or a decrease in fear and anxiety or decrease in problem behavior at home. And that's good news. Those are the children that don't necessarily need our intervention or our services or our attention. But we do have about a third of them who do have this increased fear and anxiety and these problem behaviors at home. And then you look at the next group, the next two bullets on here, the anger about military requirements and problems behaviors at school. This is where folks in your position come from in terms of 20% may show additional problem behaviors at school. And that's where challenges and strategies that you folks might want to take a look at for this 20%. So again, overall, they are doing well. But when we take a look at current research, typically it looks at the effects of one deployment. And based on the last 17 years, families with one deployment are pretty rare. So there are concerns now about repeated deployments in young children and the long-term impact. Yes, the child had one deployment when they were 6 years old, and then there was another deployment when they were 10, and another deployment when they were 12, and then now they're 15, and they're now going on the 4th deployment. So what does this repeated deployments, how does that impact children in the long term? And one of the things that we are really trying to do is identify these risk and protective factors. What kind of puts children at risk, and then what can we have in place that might provide a buffer or some protective factors so they're not impacted as much as we think. So one study from Dr. Tricia Lester, and she's at UCLA, and is well known just in terms of military research. She's also the director of the FOCUS program. So they looked at factors that predict child's difficulty with parental deployment, and this is based on actually one deployment. So looking at parental stress at home, that is a risk factor. The age of the parents, the length of marriage, and their education. So what may seem obvious is that, if the parents are younger, they are not married very long, and if they have a lower education level, then those could predict the children's difficulty with deployment. External support systems, we know as educators within the school setting, support systems for families, for children are exceptionally important. Age of the child, we do know that teens may be at more risk than younger children. And we do know, and it's been shown by multiple studies, that the total number of months deployed does have a factor. So it's not the number of deployments, it's the total cumulative months of deployment. So a parent could have been deployed only twice, but if they were deployed 18 months, both times, that's 36 months, that child may have more risk factors than, for example, a parent who is deployed 5 times and only 2 months at each time, in total of 10 months. So it's actually the total cumulative months of the deployment. And that research finding has been pretty consistent. So one of the things that I want to share with you is a study that actually the Military Family Research Institute did about multiple deployments. So we conducted this study at the request of the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Military, Community, and Family Policy. And the purpose was to kind of assess what is this relationship between exposure to parental deployments and children's outcomes in several important developmental and mental health dimensions. So it's really this first study of its kind that looks at this comprehensive picture of children's experiences when they were very, very young. So at the time of the study, these children were 2 to 10 years of age, but the study was done back in 2012 with results published in 2014. So between the time the study was conducted, between now, these children who were 0 to 10 are probably now in your programs in terms of being in middle school and high school. So what do we find in terms of risk factors? So again, these are children that have experienced multiple deployments, and about 18% of their lives have been separated from their parents. So overall, about 18% of their lives have been in terms of separation from the parent. So we looked at some risk factors. And so here we see this cumulative deployment exposure. So again, more months of deployment is a risk factor. Frequent relocation in terms of moving a lot. The rate of parental depression, so how is that at-home parent doing? And parent alcohol misuse. So these are home factors that you may or may not be exposed to, but when you're thinking about working with children, these might be some things to pay attention to if the child is making some statements about, my mom seems to be sad all the time, gosh, my dad drinks a lot of beer, those kinds of things. So they may give some insights to what's happening within that. And then some community context in terms of, does the community, do they live in a high poverty rate area or high unhealthy days, just in terms of access to medical care and the health of the community? So those were some risk factors. So then we also want to look at what are protective factors. What are the factors that actually kind of buffer the children from these risk factors? So we look at the military service of the parent. So if the parent is active duty, then that is a protective factor versus guard and reserve. And so when you think back to some slides before, we looked at reserve and guard, or the selected reserve, in terms of isolation, the suddenly military, so they're not, in terms of geographic dispersion, they're not near other people who are similar to themselves. When a caregiver parent has a bachelor's or graded, so this education, So we know that if they have higher education, it's a protective factor. If parents are married or partnered versus single parents, and if there's high state of family functioning. And then within the community context, if there's high rate of home ownership, and within the healthy communities, availability of primary care physicians, that there are sufficient physicians for the population. And that's usually listed at 100,000, one physician per every 100,000 of the population. So those are some risk factors and the protective factors that we have seen within the study.
Kathy, this is Caitlin. I'm going to interrupt. Someone had a question about the graphic you had that was about the survey of active duty spouses.
Sure, I can go back.
And specifically, it looks like the fear and anxiety. Was that parents' perception of child fear and anxiety, or the actual child's fear and anxiety?
So this is a survey of the active duty spouses. And so this is not asking children themselves. It is the parental report of what they anticipate for the child. So this is parental report. This particular survey does not specifically talk to children. Most of the surveys on military children do and are based on parental reports. It's very, very difficult to study military children and survey military children. They're a highly, highly protected class of individuals. And so a lot of the responses do rely on parental reports.
Great, thank you.
Okay. All right, so I will scroll through these back to where we were. Okay, so some other findings with that multiple deployments. So we know that young children, and these again were 0 to 10 years of age at the time of the study, so now they are in the middle school and high school years, that we know that they've been separated from their parents on average about 18% of their life, so about 2 months every year of their life, which is quite a significant amount of time. We did see that a child being born during deployment did pose additional risks in terms of social development. We do see that their children's social emotional adjustment was related to the parent's psychological health. And this is not just in military families, we see this in civilian families as well. So the parental psychological health of that in the home, if the parent is not doing well psychologically, then the chances that the child has difficulties is enhanced. So, so this is not unique to military families, but it's just important to point out that, you know, if the stay-at-home parent or the stay-at-home caregiver is not doing well, the chances that the child has difficulties is increased. They did see that children with tumor risk factors were more likely to have negative outcomes, but you pair that with the presence of even one protective factor, then most children avoid the negative outcomes. And so when you take a look at some of those protective factors, there are things that, you know, really help children, and then some things that may not necessarily help as well. So then the question gets posed, what are some things that can help? So we asked parents, so this is the same 2016 active duty spouse. So in a parent perspective, what things do they see as important in terms of how we can help children cope with deployments? And so even though this asked of the parents, some of these things can be implemented, or you can have an impact in your schools as well. So ability to maintain stable household routine. So this is, you know, we still eat dinner at the same time, we still get up at the same time, we all do the same things, and so, you know, things just don't go to, you know, go by the wayside when the parent is gone. Just that stability, and part of that too is predictability. We are creatures of habit, and children really want a stable environment. They want things that they can count on, and so the stable home environment. Think about what does that mean for you in the classrooms or in the schools? Is that the classroom, the school is predictable. I know what to expect. I know what behavior. So even if everything else is falling apart in my life, I can count on school. It's the same. It's a sense of safety and security. How that stay-behind parent supports the deployment. So if the parent supports the deployment, then that's seen as important for helping children cope with deployments. And so if you know of children who do have a parent gone, you may ask them, so how does mom or dad feel about, mom or dad being gone? And just kind of conversing with the child that way. Communication with the deployed parent, and this sometimes can be a catch-22. Sometimes communication is really good, and sometimes communication can be a challenge. And so sometimes it really just depends upon the child. We also know through other research that depending upon the age of the child, they do make decisions when they're communicating with their deployed parent about what to tell them. So they kind of buffer what they tell them. They don't want to tell them necessarily things that are going to distract them, things that they can't do anything about. And so even our young adolescent and preteen children make conscious decisions about what to tell their parent who is deployed. And so think about, as a young child, trying to make those decisions about what am I going to say so my parent doesn't worry. So those kinds of things. So again, this communication can be a catch-22. And again, geographic stability during deployment, which in some cases families don't have an option. If I'm a single parent and I have a 12-year-old and they're going to go with my sister can't pick up her household and move to where my child is. My child has to pick up and move to where my sister is. And so that stability, I'm not only losing my parent in terms of they're going to be gone, but I'm losing my friends, I'm losing my house, I can't take everything in my bedroom. And so this stability becomes an issue. So this is what parents have seen as important. And so a lot of these things you can incorporate in terms of how you interact with military youth. So what can you do as professionals on other aspects? So know who the children are in your schools. And so we do know that 86% of our military connected youth are educated within community schools. Most installations do not have schools run by Department of Defense. They are in community schools. And so the chances that you have some military affiliated youth within your school system or even in your building is kind of high. We do have now in 2015, they passed the Every Student Succeed Acts, which includes this MSI, this Military School Identifier, which wanted to be able to track the military affiliation of children, just to really kind of see how military connected children are doing. And the student identifier should hopefully be able to enable educators, school officials, just to be able to identify children within their facilities. And states at this point are in different levels of adaptations and implementation of this. But the way that the law was written, it only needed to track active duty or children of active duty. There was nothing in that required identifying children of National Guard or Reserve component families. And so that's missing a big chunk of military impacted youth. Now, some states may include that. You may just have to find out what your state or your school district's progress is on that, and do they include looking at selected reserve, so that reserve and National Guard. And that may be a thing that you ask, because if your school district only records active duty, again, you might miss a large chunk of military connected youth. Know what to look for in terms of the warning signs. So we looked at some of the challenging behaviors, the fear and anxiety problem behaviors at school. And so if you see a child who you may think is military affiliated and they're having some challenging behaviors, either externalizing behaviors or internalizing, you may want to find the cause for that challenging behavior. So if you have an adolescent who's acting out, is it because of military deployment, or is it just because of being adolescent? One of the things too, in terms of professionals, open lines of communication. They may not necessarily be able to talk to their stay-behind parent or caregiver. If that stay-behind parent or caregiver is having difficulties emotionally, that youth may say, I can't burden them. Maybe I'm taking care of the stay-behind parent more than I think I should. And so they don't have anyone necessarily to talk to. So keeping those lines of communication open. keeping your own political views out of the interactions. This kind of goes back to the military military-civilian divide slide. Whatever you feel about military service, being at war, those kinds of things, the child didn't choose this. And so keeping those out of your interactions, and be the one adult who does care. You can be a protective factor for these children. And then kind of create your own resource toolkit, know what resources within your community. And I have some listed here on this slide. So these are all places where you can go for additional information. We have a How to Help series here at MFRI. We have the Military Child Education Coalition and all of these resources. And I'm kind of looking at the time, and we're approaching only about 8 minutes left. But on the slides, there are the links to those resources that are on this particular slide. So that is what I have. I do have some references in terms of those studies. And so that is my contact information. And so I guess at this point, we'll leave it open for questions.
Terrific, Kathy. Thank you so much. That was wonderful information, and I think really insightful for folks to think about in terms of the community that we're in and the students that we're interacting with. Let's see. So if you have any questions or comments, please take a moment, put those in the chat box. While we have Kathy, it'd be great to pick her brain a little bit. If you'll notice in the chat box, there is the website. Caitlin put the website for MFRI so that you can do some poking around in there too. But I'll pause for a moment and we can take some questions. I'll get back to you. I just wanted to let you all know about some upcoming webinars that we have on May 21st, and we're working on the time. That's why there's no time listed there. On May 21st, we have SBIRT for Teens, which is a screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment for substance use for teens, and implementing that within various settings. Our presenter is Mallory DeSalle, who's a licensed mental health counselor. In June, we'll have Amy Thompson talking about gun violence in schools. And in July, we'll have Anissa Hemming from the Center for Green Schools, who will be doing a webinar for us. Just as a reminder, this webinar is eligible for one continuing education hour for through NCHEC for CHES or MCHES. You can also get a participation certificate should you want to submit this to a different credentialing body. Members receive free continuing education credits, and non-members may purchase those for $30. And CEs may be obtained by completing the webinar evaluation. Caitlin has put that in the chat box, so you can just click there and fill that out. You'll also get an email at the end of the webinar, maybe tomorrow. We'll give Caitlin a little time till tomorrow, that will show you how to access that that survey, as well as how to access a recording of the webinar, as well as the PowerPoints. So I'll pause one more time to allow some time for questions. Okay, well, I want to thank Kathy so much for participating today. I am so thankful for you being here. I'm thankful for all of you joining us, and to Caitlin for making sure that everything runs smoothly. So have a terrific day, and we hope to see you back here again next month. Have a great afternoon.